With his brother Logan's body lying beside him on a narrow, storm-swept ledge, a dying Lucas Bennett used his last ounce of strength to rig their ropes into a final intricate knot. His goal was simple: to ensure that even in death the mountain would never separate them. For 7 years, their bodies remained undiscovered, a testament to a bond that defied survival. Then, in 2011, a rescue helicopter spotted the impossible: 2 skeletons, still roped together, suspended 800 feet up the sheer, unclimbed face of Devil's Spire. The discovery promised closure to a heartbreaking mystery, confirming a tragic climbing accident. But the real story began when investigators reviewed the high-resolution aerial photos from the original 2004 search. They zoomed in on the exact coordinates where the bodies were found, and their blood ran cold. The photos showed nothing but a sheer vertical wall of granite. The ledge the brothers were found on wasn't there 7 years ago. If you've ever wondered what secrets our most remote wilderness areas hold, this story might keep you up tonight. Drop a comment letting us know if you've ever experienced something unexplainable in the outdoors. And if this is your first time hearing the shocking story of the Bennett twins, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories that prove sometimes the most haunting mysteries aren't buried in the ground. They're hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look in the right direction. Alexander Bennett sat in the dimly lit study of his modest Montana cabin, surrounded by the remnants of a 7-year investigation that had yielded nothing but dead ends. Maps of Wyoming's Wind River Range covered the walls, red pins marking search areas, blue pins indicating possible sightings, and yellow pins representing places he still needed to explore. Missing person flyers with the smiling faces of his twin sons were scattered across his desk, some with corners curled from handling, others faded from sunlight that streamed through the blinds he rarely adjusted anymore. Police reports and search and rescue files formed precarious stacks on the floor, a collection he'd read so many times he could recite passages from memory. Beside his armchair, a small table held a dozen unopened sympathy cards. Alexander couldn't bring himself to read them. Acknowledging the condolences felt too much like accepting his sons were gone forever. At 62, Alexander's once robust frame had grown gaunt over the years. His beard, now completely gray, framed a face weathered not just by decades of mountain climbing, but by grief that had carved permanent lines around his eyes. Those eyes, still sharp and alert despite his age, moved methodically between photographs of the Devil's Spire and his own handwritten notes from his last conversation with his sons. "We're going to conquer it, Dad," Logan had said, excitement vibrating in his voice over the phone. "The western face has never been climbed. We'll be the first." "Just remember the rules," Alexander had replied, the lifetime climber in him overriding the worried father. "Dad, we've been climbing since we were 12, Lucas had chimed in, having taken the phone from his brother. "We've got this." Those were the last words Alexander had heard from his son. Every morning for 7 years, Alexander had maintained the same ritual. Wake at 5 a.m., coffee, review the maps, check the weather reports from the Wind River Range, call his contact at the Wyoming State Police for updates, though those calls now went unanswered more often than not. In the afternoon, he'd drive to town to check his P.O. box for responses to the letters he sent to climbers who might have been in the area in 2004. Evening brought more coffee and the examination of climbing forums where he'd posted about his sons. The wall opposite his desk displayed dozens of photographs of Logan and Lucas as toddlers gripping the same stuffed bear, as teenagers scaling their first serious rock face in Glacier National Park, as young men standing triumphant atop Mount Rainier. Their identical grins and the matching dimples in their left cheeks were painful to behold now. Alexander's fingers traced the edge of a topographical map of the Devil's Spire area.
He'd highlighted the twins' planned route in green, but the reality was they might never have followed it. The mountain had its own plans for climbers, especially ambitious ones like his sons. His phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. Alexander glanced at the caller ID, Wyoming State Police. His heart quickened as he answered, though experience had taught him to temper his hope. "Mr. Bennett, this is Sergeant Powell. I think you should sit down. There's been a development." Alexander and Lucas Bennett were born 6 minutes apart on a stormy April night in 1979. From the beginning, they shared more than just identical DNA. As toddlers, they developed their own twin language, communicating through sounds and gestures that baffled even their parents. By age 8, they were finishing each other's sentences, a habit that would follow them into adulthood. When one fell ill, the other often developed symptoms within hours. But their most profound connection emerged when Alexander first took them rock climbing at Glacier National Park when they were 12. "It was like watching two parts of the same organism," recalled Donna Harris, a family friend and experienced climber who had been there that day. Logan would reach for a handhold, and without looking, Lucas would adjust his stance to compensate. They moved together perfectly, like they shared one mind split between two bodies. By 16, the Bennett brothers had become known in Montana's climbing circles for their uncanny ability to tackle routes that stymied climbers with twice their experience. Their identical appearance, both with sandy brown hair, lean muscular builds, and striking blue eyes, made them seem almost mythical on the rock face, as if one climber was appearing in two places simultaneously. "They were something special to watch," said Gregory Vaughn, who had climbed with the twins throughout their teenage years. "Most climbing partners take years to develop the kind of trust and communication the twins had naturally. They never seemed to doubt each other, never second-guessed a move the other was making." After graduating high school, both brothers attended Montana State University, majoring in geology and spending every available weekend scaling increasingly difficult peaks. Their reputation grew as they documented first ascents of several challenging routes in Montana and Wyoming. By their mid-20s, they had become minor celebrities in the climbing world, known simply as the Bennett brothers. Climbing magazines featured their exploits, and equipment companies began sending them free gear to test.
Their ambition grew with their reputation. What had started as weekend adventures became multi-week expeditions to remote locations. They climbed in the Cascades, the Sierra Nevada, and even spent a season in Patagonia. But one challenge loomed largest in their imagination: the unclimbed western face of Devil's Spire in Wyoming's Wind River Range. "They talked about that climb for years," Alexander said, showing a reporter a well-worn photo of the imposing rock formation. "It became something of an obsession for them. The western face is nearly vertical for over 1,000 feet, with few natural features and exposed to unpredictable wind patterns. Most experienced climbers won't go near it." The twins meticulously prepared for the Devil's Spire expedition. They studied topographical maps, consulted with meteorologists about typical weather patterns in July, and trained specifically for the type of climbing the western face would require. They assembled the best equipment available, much of it specially designed for extreme vertical ascents. "Safety was always their priority," insisted Alexander. Despite their reputation for taking on difficult climbs, they were methodical in their preparation. They never went into a situation blind. Sophia Reynolds, Lucas's girlfriend at the time, remembered their departure. "They were so excited, like kids on Christmas morning. Lucas kept saying this climb would put them on the map, make them legends in the climbing community. But they weren't reckless. I watched them pack, triple-checking their gear, reviewing emergency procedures. They knew the risks, but they believed they had mitigated them." The twins left Bozeman, Montana on July 15, 2004, driving their shared Jeep Cherokee packed with enough supplies for a 10-day expedition. They planned to spend 2 days hiking to the base of Devil's Spire, 3 days examining the western face and planning their route, and then 2 to 3 days for the actual climb, depending on conditions. The remaining days were a buffer for unexpected weather or difficulties. "The last thing Logan said to me," Alexander recalled, his voice catching, was, "Next time you see us, we'll have conquered the unconquerable." I told them to just make sure there was a next time. I'd been climbing long enough to know that mountains don't care about human ambition. No one could have predicted that within a week, the Bennett brothers would vanish without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the climbing community for 7 years. The last confirmed sighting of Logan and Lucas Bennett came on July 17, 2004, when they stopped at a general store in Pinedale, Wyoming, the nearest town to their destination. Security footage showed them purchasing additional supplies, extra batteries for their headlamps, energy bars, and a weather radio. The store clerk remembered them clearly. "They were in high spirits," Marge Donovan said, who worked at Pinedale General Store for over 20 years. "Identical twins aren't something you forget, especially when they're both talking over each other about climbing some dangerous peak. I remember warning them about a storm system moving in later that week. They thanked me and said they'd keep an eye on it." The twins' Jeep Cherokee was found 3 days later at the Elkhart Park Trailhead, the most common access point for hikers and climbers entering the Wind River Range. Their parking permit, properly displayed on the dashboard, indicated they planned to return on July 25th. Inside the vehicle, investigators found nothing unusual. Maps marked with their planned route, extra clothing for their return journey, and their car keys tucked into the center console. "That last detail always struck me as odd," noted Detective Frank Sullivan, who led the initial investigation. "Experienced backcountry travelers typically keep their keys with them, even on the trail. It's a basic safety measure." The fact that they left them in the vehicle suggested they intended to return to exactly that spot. According to their itinerary left with Alexander, the twins planned to hike approximately 18 miles from the trailhead to Island Lake, where they would establish a base camp before proceeding to Devil's Spire. When they failed to return by July 26th, Alexander reported them missing. The search operation began immediately and grew to become one of the largest in Wyoming's history. Over 200 volunteers combed the rugged terrain, assisted by search dogs, helicopters, and experienced alpine rescue teams. The operation faced significant challenges from the beginning. The Wind River Range encompasses over 2.25 million acres of wilderness, with countless places where two climbers could have encountered trouble. On July 30th, 5 days into the search, a breakthrough came when a team discovered the twins' campsite at Island Lake. The scene was puzzling. Their tent was properly set up, sleeping bags neatly arranged inside. Their cooking equipment was stowed, food hanging correctly from a bear bag in a nearby tree. Their backpacks contained their hiking clothes and personal items. The only equipment missing was their climbing gear: ropes, harnesses, carabiners, helmets, and climbing shoes. "It looked like they had stepped away temporarily and planned to return," said Maria Cardova, a search and rescue volunteer who discovered the campsite. "There were no signs of wildlife disturbance, no indication of a struggle or panic. Their journal, which we found in one of the backpacks, had entries up to July 19th, describing their excitement about beginning their climb the next morning."
The discovery of the campsite narrowed the search area considerably. Teams now focused on the Devil's Spire and surrounding terrain. Helicopters circled the massive rock formation, pilots and spotters scanning every ledge and crevice for signs of the missing climbers.
Dalton Tucker, another climber who had been in the area that week, reported seeing two figures matching the twins' description approaching the western face of Devil's Spire around mid-morning on July 20th. They were moving confidently, carrying what looked like a full rack of climbing gear, Tucker stated. I was headed out of the area because of the approaching weather system, and I considered warning them, but they were too far away to hail. That was the last anyone saw of them, as far as I know. The weather system that Marge Donovan had warned about hit the Wind River Range on the evening of July 20th, a severe thunderstorm with high winds, lightning, and heavy rain that lasted through the night and into the next day. Such conditions would make climbing extremely dangerous, if not impossible. If they were on the face when that storm hit, their chances of survival would have been minimal, explained Ranger Thomas Blackhawk, who coordinated with search teams. Exposed on a rock face during a lightning storm, it's every climber's nightmare. As days turned into weeks, the search continued, but with diminishing resources. Helicopter flights became less frequent and many volunteers returned to their jobs and families. By mid-August, the operation had been downgraded to limited continuous search, with teams going out only when new information emerged. On September 10, 2004, after nearly 6 weeks of searching without further clues, Wyoming State Police officially classified Logan and Lucas Bennett as missing, presumed deceased. The case remained open, but active search operations were suspended. Alexander Bennett refused to accept this conclusion. They didn't just vanish, he insisted at the time. Two experienced climbers don't just disappear without leaving some trace. Something happened up there, and I'm going to find out what it was. As autumn descended on the Wind River Range, covering the high country in snow and making further search efforts impossible until spring, the investigation into the Bennett twins' disappearance entered a new phase. Detectives focused on 3 main theories: a fatal climbing accident, voluntary disappearance, or foul play. The accident theory seemed most likely to investigators. The western face of Devil's Spire is extremely technical climbing. Add in the unexpected storm and you have conditions ripe for disaster. Most likely they fell during the climb and their bodies ended up in a location that was simply inaccessible to our search teams. This explanation satisfied most observers, but left key questions unanswered. No equipment had been found on or around the spire. No ropes, no carabiners, no trace of their presence on the rock face itself. In most climbing accidents, some gear remains visible or becomes lodged in crevices. The voluntary disappearance theory gained traction after investigators discovered the twins had withdrawn $5,000 from their joint bank account 2 weeks before the climb. That's a significant amount for 2 young men who lived modestly, noted Detective Sullivan. Combined with the keys left in the vehicle, perhaps as a red herring, it raised questions about their intentions. This theory collapsed when financial audits showed the money had been spent on high-end climbing equipment for the expedition, all of which was documented with receipts found in their apartment. The foul play theory remained the most tenuous. The twins had no known enemies, Sullivan stated, no significant debts, no involvement in criminal activity, and the logistics of harming 2 athletic young men in such remote terrain, then disposing of their bodies without leaving evidence, stretches credibility. By winter, the investigation had essentially stalled. The case file remained open, but active work on it dwindled as detectives were assigned to new cases with fresher leads. Alexander Bennett refused to accept the lack of progress. He took a leave of absence from his job as a geology professor and rented a small apartment in Pinedale to be closer to the search area. When spring came, he was the first to request permits to access the backcountry around Devil's Spire. I spent that entire summer searching, Alexander recalled. I retraced their steps from the trailhead to Island Lake dozens of times. I examined every approach to the western face. I climbed every accessible route on the neighboring peaks to get different vantage points of areas we might have missed. Alexander's solitary search yielded nothing new, but it established a pattern he would follow for years to come. Each summer, he returned to the Wind River Range, focusing on different sectors, different theories. He hired private investigators when he could afford them. He consulted with climbing experts, search and rescue specialists, even psychics, anything that might provide a new angle on his son's fate. "The not knowing is what destroys you," he explained to a journalist who interviewed him in 2007. "If I could just understand what happened, if I could just bring them home and give them a proper burial, maybe then I could start to grieve properly." As the years passed, the media interest in the case diminished. The annual stories marking the anniversary of the disappearance moved from the front page to the local interest section, then stopped altogether. The climbing community, initially galvanized by the mystery, gradually returned to discussing new routes, new achievements, new stars in the sport.
By 2009, 5 years after the disappearance, even Alexander's most dedicated supporters began suggesting he find a way to move forward. His ex-wife, Kathleen, who had divorced him long before the twins disappeared, urged him to seek counseling. "You're keeping them alive by keeping the search alive," she told him during a rare phone call. "But you are not alive, Alex. You're just existing." Alexander's response was to sell his house in Montana and use the proceeds to fund another year of searching. He published a book about the case, Brothers on the Edge: The Disappearance of Logan and Lucas Bennett, hoping to revive public interest and possibly generate new leads. The book sold modestly, but produced no breakthroughs. By 2011, the 7th anniversary of the disappearance, Alexander's resources were nearly exhausted. His health had deteriorated from years of high-altitude searching and poor self-care. His connections at the Wyoming State Police had retired or moved on to other positions. His file of possible leads had grown thin, filled mostly with rehashed theories and second-hand accounts. On the morning of July 20th, 2011, exactly 7 years since the twins were last seen approaching Devil's Spire, Alexander sat at his desk in the rented cabin, staring at the phone that hadn't rung in months. His calendar showed he had an appointment that afternoon with a realtor to discuss selling the Montana property he'd been holding for his sons. "Maybe it's time," he whispered to himself, his finger tracing the outline of the twins in his favorite photograph. "Maybe it's finally time to let you go." As he reached for the realtor's business card, his phone rang. The screen displayed Wyoming State Police. The Bell 407 helicopter banked sharply as it approached the sheer rock face of Hammer Peak, responding to an emergency call about an injured climber stranded on the eastern route. Pilot Nancy Rodriguez had been flying search and rescue missions in the Wind River Range for over a decade, but she never got used to the treacherous air currents that swirled around the jagged peaks. "We're 2 minutes out," she informed her crew, paramedic Keith Davidson and rescue specialist Ben Takota. "The victim is reportedly on a ledge about 600 feet up, south-facing side." As they rounded the mountain, the morning sun struck the rock face, temporarily blinding Rodriguez. She adjusted her course slightly, bringing them about a half-mile south of their target location. That's when Takota spotted something unusual on the western face of the neighboring formation, the infamous Devil's Spire. "Nancy, hold position," he called through the intercom. 2 o'clock, about 800 feet up the western face, there's something on that ledge." Rodriguez steadied the helicopter, hovering about 300 yards from the spire. Through binoculars, Takota examined what had caught his attention. A flash of color against the gray rock that didn't match the natural environment. "I'm seeing what looks like climbing equipment, ropes possibly." "Wait," his voice faltered. "Those are remains, human remains, 2 bodies, looks like they've been there a long time." Davidson moved to Takota's side of the helicopter, peering through his own binoculars. "Confirmed. Skeletal remains, still in climbing harnesses. They're connected by ropes in some kind of unusual configuration."
We need to document this and report it, Rodriguez decided. I'll do a slow circle around the ledge while you take photos that will continue to our primary rescue. As the helicopter circled the site, Tecolda captured dozens of images. What they saw defied immediate explanation. 2 skeletal remains lay on a narrow ledge, perhaps 3 feet wide, that cut across the otherwise vertical face of Devil's Spire. One figure was positioned closer to the edge, arms extended outwards, still secured in a climbing harness. The second figure lay about 6 feet behind, also in a harness, with the climbing rope between them forming a bizarre pattern, looped through anchors in the rock face and back to both climbers in a way that suggested intentional arrangement, rather than the result of a fall. No way that's an accidental configuration, Tecolda, an experienced climber himself, muttered. Someone positioned those bodies that way. After completing their primary rescue mission, the crew reported their discovery to the Wyoming State Police. Within hours, a specialized recovery team was assembled, including forensic experts, experienced climbers, and detectives from the Cold Case Unit. The location of the remains, on a nearly inaccessible ledge 800 feet above the valley floor on a rock face that had claimed numerous lives, presented extraordinary challenges. This will be one of the most difficult recovery operations we have ever attempted, Sergeant Powell admitted in the preliminary briefing. The ledge can only be reached by expert climbers, and even then, extracting the remains will require perfect weather conditions and specialized equipment. The news of the discovery spread quickly through law enforcement channels, eventually reaching Detective Sullivan, now retired but still haunted by the unsolved case of the Bennett twins. When they described the location and the 2 sets of remains still connected by ropes, I knew immediately who they'd found. The question wasn't who, but how. How did they end up there, in that position, and why hadn't we spotted them during the initial search? Sergeant Powell made the call to Alexander Bennett personally. "Mr. Bennett, this is Sergeant Powell from Wyoming State Police. I think you should sit down. There's been a development in your son's case." Alexander's fingers tightened around the phone. "You found them," he said. Not a question, but a statement. "A rescue helicopter spotted what appears to be 2 sets of remains on the western face of Devil's Spire this morning. Based on the location and equipment visible, we believe they may be Logan and Lucas. We're organizing a recovery operation now." "I'm coming," Alexander said immediately. "I'll be there by nightfall." "Mr. Bennett, the recovery could take days to organize. The location is extremely— 7 years, Sergeant. I've waited 7 years. I'll be there when you bring my boys home." The drive from his cabin to the Wind River Range passed in a blur for Alexander. His mind raced with questions. Why hadn't the bodies been spotted during the initial search? What had happened on that rock face? Why were they still connected by ropes after all this time?
By sunset, he had reached the command post that had been established at the Elkhart Park trailhead. Television news vans were already setting up, reporters preparing for the dramatic story of the long-missing climbers finally discovered. Alexander ignored them, walking directly to the operations tent where Sergeant Powell was coordinating with the recovery team. "Mr. Bennett," Powell acknowledged him, offering a firm handshake. "I'd like to show you what we've found." He led Alexander to a table where a laptop displayed the photos taken by the helicopter crew. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the images of his son's remains, still clad in the distinctive red and blue harnesses he had given them as gifts for their 24th birthday. "That's them," he confirmed, his voice barely audible. "That's Logan in the red harness, closer to the edge. Lucas always wore blue." Powell nodded solemnly. "The recovery team will begin their ascent at first light tomorrow. The weather forecast is favorable, but this is still an extremely dangerous operation. We've assembled the best climbers in the region, including 2 who participated in the original search." Alexander studied the photos more carefully, his experienced climber's eye picking up details others might miss. "The rope configuration is wrong," he said suddenly. "That's not how climbers would be connected in a typical ascent or descent.
And look at these anchors. They're placed in a pattern I've never seen before." Powell exchanged glances with a climbing expert who had been consulting on the operation. "We noticed that too," the expert admitted. "The positioning suggests intentional arrangement rather than the result of an accident." "What are you saying?" Alexander demanded. "That someone moved their bodies after they died?" "We won't know anything for certain until we complete the recovery and examination," Powell said carefully. "But yes, the evidence suggests the bodies may have been manipulated after death. The question is whom and why." Alexander spent the night at the command post, refusing offers of accommodation in town. He sat outside his vehicle, staring up at the silhouette of Devil's Spire, barely visible against the night sky. Somewhere on that dark mass of rock were his sons, waiting to finally come home. At dawn, the recovery team began their ascent, a process slowed by the need to document everything exactly as found. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the ledge. The team leader's voice crackled over the radio to the command post. "We've reached the remains, confirming 2 individuals, both in climbing harnesses, connected by ropes as photographed. But there's something else here. A weatherproof case secured to the rock face appears to contain a notebook or journal." Alexander's head snapped up at this news. A journal? After 7 years exposed to the elements, could there actually be a first-hand account of what had happened to his sons? 4 hours later, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, the recovery team completed their grim task. 2 body bags were carefully lowered down the rock face, along with bags of evidence collected from the site. Alexander stood motionless as the remains of his sons were finally brought down from the mountain that had claimed them, his face a mask of grief and relief intermingled. "We did it, boys. We're taking you home." The forensic examination of Logan and Lucas Bennett's remains began the following morning at the Wyoming State Medical Examiner's Facility in Cheyenne. Dr. Nina Thashenko, the state's most experienced forensic anthropologist, led the investigation, with Alexander present as an observer, an unusual accommodation granted due to the high-profile nature of the case and his 7-year search. The examination room was clinical and bright, a stark contrast to the wild mountain environment where the twins had spent their final moments. Alexander sat in a corner, his face ashen but composed, as technicians carefully laid out the remains and associated equipment on stainless steel tables. Based on the level of decomposition and environmental effects, the estimated time of death is consistent with their disappearance in July 2004. Both individuals are male, mid-20s, identical in skeletal structure, as would be expected with monozygotic twins. The first unusual finding came when she examined Logan's remains more closely. Subject A shows evidence of compound fractures to both legs, consistent with a fall from significant height. The tibias and fibulas of both legs show multiple break points. There is also a comminuted fracture of the right femur, and several vertebrae show compression fractures. She moved to the second set of remains. Subject B shows no evidence of similar traumatic injuries. There are, however, indications of exposure and likely starvation. The fingertips show unusual wear patterns consistent with extensive climbing without proper equipment or protection.
Alexander watched silently as the examination continued, each revelation painting a clearer picture of his son's final days. The climbing gear told its own story. Logan's harness showed significant strain damage to the load-bearing points, while Lucas's equipment displayed unusual wear patterns that didn't match typical climbing use. "The rope configuration is particularly puzzling," noted Carlos Mendoza, a climbing expert brought in to consult on the technical aspects of the case. "It's been arranged in what we call a counter-tension system, typically used for horizontal traverses across a rock face.
but the anchors are positioned in a way that suggests it was set up after Logan's fall, not before. The most compelling piece of evidence came in the form of the waterproof case recovered from the ledge. Inside was a journal, its pages yellowed but largely intact thanks to the specialized case designed to withstand extreme conditions. The handwriting was immediately recognizable to Alexander as Lucas's distinctive script. "That's Lucas's journal," he confirmed. "He kept one on every climb they did." Detective Sullivan, called back to consult on the case, opened the journal carefully, wearing gloves. The entries begin on July 15, 2004, and continue through July 30th, 10 days after they were last seen approaching the spire. Alexander's breath caught. 10 days? They survived for 10 days after the storm? Sullivan nodded grimly. According to these entries, yes, but the story they tell is difficult. The journal, combined with the forensic evidence, began to form a narrative that none of the investigators had anticipated. On the morning of July 20th, 2004, Logan and Lucas had begun their attempt on the western face of Devil's Spire. Their progress was good through the morning, with Logan leading the more technical sections, as was their usual practice. Around mid-afternoon, they reached a particularly challenging section, approximately 800 feet up the face. The journal described it as a blank section with minimal features requiring perfect balance and finger strength. Logan, leading this pitch, had just placed an anchor and was reaching for the next hold when the storm hit more suddenly than forecasted. Lucas's journal entry from that evening read, "The lightning came out of nowhere. 1 minute clear skies, the next an explosion of thunder that shook the entire spire. L was fully exposed on the face. I was anchored at the belay station. He yelled something I couldn't hear over the wind, then a bolt struck somewhere above him. He lost his grip, fell about 20 feet before the last anchor caught him, but the impact against the rock was terrible. I heard the snap of bones even over the storm." The following entries detailed Lucas's desperate attempts to reach his injured brother, who was dangling from the rope about 15 feet below the small ledge where Lucas was anchored. In driving rain and wind, he managed to rig a system to pull Logan up to the ledge, a nearly impossible feat of strength and technical skill. July 21. L's legs are shattered. He's in agony despite the painkillers from our first aid kit. The radio was damaged in the storm, no way to call for help. We're trapped on this ledge. Can't go up with L injured, can't go down in these conditions. The ledge is barely wide enough for both of us. I've anchored us securely. We have 3 days of water, 5 days of fruit if we ration. Someone will come looking when we don't return to the campsite." But no one had spotted them on the ledge during the search. Dr. Vaschenko explained why as she examined photos of the site. "The ledge is positioned in such a way that it's nearly invisible from below. From above, it would appear as just another shadow on the rock face. Even from a helicopter, at the wrong angle or time of day, 2 climbers huddled on that narrow space would be extremely difficult to spot." The journal entries grew more desperate as days passed. By July 25th, their water was gone. By July 27th, Logan's condition had deteriorated significantly from infection setting into his open fractures. July 27th, L is delirious with fever. Keeps talking about our first climb in Glacier when we were kids. I've done everything I can for him, but without water, without antibiotics, I know what's coming. I can't bear it, but I can't leave him either. We always said we'd climb together or not at all. Looks like we meant it more literally than we knew. The final entry, dated July 30th, was the most difficult for Alexander to hear. L passed during the night. I held him as he went. He wasn't in pain at the end. He just drifted away, smiling about something only he could see. I can't leave him here. Can't leave him alone on this mountain. There's no way down for me anyway. Too weak now, hands too damaged from trying to climb out for help.
So I'm securing us both to this ledge with what's left of our gear. If we can't leave this mountain alive, we'll become part of it together. Whoever finds this, tell our father we followed all his rules. Sometimes the mountain decides anyway." Alexander turned away, unable to contain his grief as the full truth of his son's final days was revealed. Lucas hadn't died in the initial accident or storm. He had survived, only to face an impossible choice: try to descend alone for help, leaving his critically injured brother, or stay and almost certainly die alongside him. He had chosen the latter. The unusual rope configuration suddenly made sense. Lucas had used the remaining equipment to secure both himself and his brother's body to the ledge, ensuring that even after his own death, they would remain together. The anchors had been placed with the last of his strength, a final act of brotherhood that had kept them united even in death. The technical skill required to set up that anchor system in his weakened condition is almost unbelievable, Mendoza commented. It's like he was determined that even the mountain itself wouldn't separate them.
The forensic investigation continued for several more days, documenting every detail for the official record. The cause of death was determined to be exposure and dehydration for Lucas, while Logan had died from trauma complications related to his injuries. The evidence supported everything described in the journal: a tragic accident compounded by impossible circumstances, and a brotherhood that transcended survival instinct. As the examination concluded, Dr. Veschenko approached Alexander with a small metal object. "We found this in Lucas's hand," she said gently. "His fingers were still closed around it." Alexander accepted the item, a small carabiner worn smooth in places from years of use. He recognized it immediately as the first piece of climbing equipment he had ever given his sons, engraved with their initials and the family motto, "Height reveals truth." He kept it. All those years, through all those climbs, he kept it. Detective Sullivan placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Your sons didn't just disappear, Mr. Bennett. They faced the end together on their own terms. There's a kind of honor in that, a kind of courage few of us will ever understand." Alexander closed his fingers around the carabiner, the physical connection to his son's final moments both painful and precious. "I never doubted their courage. I just wanted to bring them home. Now you can. Now you finally can." The weatherproof journal recovered from Devil's Spire became the centerpiece of the investigation, providing the most complete account of the Bennett twins' final days. Yet, as investigators studied it more closely, certain passages raised new questions rather than resolving old ones. July 22. "Something strange on the cliff face today. Markings that don't look natural, too uniform, too intentional. Elle says I'm hallucinating from pain and stress, but I swear they weren't there yesterday. Like someone carved symbols into the rock face about 10 feet above our ledge. No way anyone could have reached that spot without us seeing them." This entry, written in Logan's handwriting during a period when he was still lucid, caught the attention of Detective Sullivan. The next day's entry, written by Lucas, seemed to confirm the observation. July 23. "The markings Elle mentioned yesterday, I see them now too. Definitely not natural erosion. They form a pattern almost like letters in a script I don't recognize. Could be old survey markers, maybe from the first expeditions in this range back in the 30s. Strange that we never noticed them during our approach." Dr. Catherine Blackwood, an archaeologist from the University of Wyoming who specialized in indigenous rock art, was brought in to examine photographs of the area around the ledge. Her assessment was troubling. "These aren't survey markers," she concluded after studying enhanced images of the faint carvings. "They bear a striking resemblance to Shoshone sacred symbols, specifically those associated with what they called threshold places,
locations believed to exist between the physical world and the spirit realm. "Are you suggesting these are ancient carvings?" Sullivan asked. Dr. Blackwood shook her head. "That's what's strange. The weathering pattern suggests they're relatively recent, decades rather than centuries, but they employ symbolism that isn't widely known outside of certain Shoshone elder circles." This revelation led investigators to expand their research into the history of Devil's Spire. They discovered that the formation had significant cultural importance to the Shoshone people, who called it the Brothers' Sentinel and considered it forbidden climbing terrain. According to tribal records, 2 Shoshone brothers had died there in the 1870s while hunting. Their bodies never recovered. More peculiar details emerged as forensic technicians analyzed trace evidence from the equipment and remains. Soil samples found in the crevices of the twins' climbing shoes contained mineral compounds not native to the Wind River Range, including traces of olivine, a mineral typically associated with volcanic formations not present in Wyoming's geology. It's as if they had been climbing somewhere else entirely before reaching the ledge, noted Dr. Vaschenko, unable to explain the anomaly. The journal's final pages contained entries that investigators found increasingly difficult to reconcile with rational explanation. Lucas's handwriting became less steady, his thoughts more disjointed, expected given his deteriorating condition, but certain observations stood out as particularly strange. July 28. The light on the rock face changes when the sun sets. Not normal shadows. The markings above us seem to glow slightly. Elle noticed it first before he got too weak to stay conscious for long. I thought it was delirium, but I see it too now. A faint blue luminescence, tracing the pattern of those symbols. No natural explanation I can think of. Some kind of phosphorescent mineral, maybe. And later that same night, voices on the wind tonight. Not human, at least not like any language I've ever heard, coming from the direction of the symbols. Elle is unconscious, but he seems to respond to them, turning his head toward the sound even in his fever sleep. I'm not afraid, strangely. They feel familiar somehow, like they've been here with us all along. The final full entry from July 29th was the most enigmatic. The brothers came today. Not in body, but I felt them here. The ones the spire was named for, I think. They showed me how to secure us to the rock, so we'll stay together. Showed me the anchor placements that would hold against any storm. Elle is barely breathing now. I think they're waiting for him. For us. The markings make sense now. They're not a warning. They're a door.
Sullivan brought these entries to Alexander's attention carefully, unsure how he would react to what could easily be dismissed as the hallucinations of a dying man. "I know what you're thinking," Alexander said after reading them, "that Lucas was delirious, imagining things as he faced his own death. Maybe that's true, but the Bennett family has Scottish roots, and there's an old belief that twins share a special connection to the threshold between worlds." He paused, running his finger over the journal's weathered pages. "And the rope configuration. I've been climbing for 40 years, and I've never seen anchors placed quite that way. It's ingenious, actually, designed to withstand not just weather, but time itself. How did Lucas, in his weakened state, manage that kind of technical rigging?" The investigation continued along 2 parallel tracks. The official explanation focusing on verifiable facts and forensic evidence, while a smaller group, including Alexander and several indigenous consultants, explored the more inexplicable aspects of the case. Tribal elder Joseph Running Bear, consulted about the markings, offered a perspective that bridged both approaches. "Our stories say that twins are sacred because they represent perfect balance. When the Bennett brothers came to this sacred place, perhaps they encountered the guardians of that threshold,
Science cannot explain everything that happens on these ancient mountains. As news of the discovery spread, other climbers came forward with accounts of unusual experiences on or near Devil's Spire, unexplained equipment failures, disorienting experiences where familiar routes suddenly seemed alien, voices or sounds with no identifiable source. We tend to dismiss these stories as altitude sickness or the mind playing tricks, admitted Mendoza. But when you look at them collectively, patterns emerge that are hard to explain away. The most compelling new evidence came from an unexpected source. Travis Wilson, a climber who had been in the Wind River Range during the 2004 search operation, contacted investigators after hearing about the recovery. "I was part of a team searching the north ridge of Devil's Spire," Wilson explained when interviewed. "We had a clear view of the western face. I remember distinctly we used high-powered binoculars to scan every inch of that face. There was no ledge with two climbers on it. I would stake my life on that." Shown photographs of the location where the twins were found, Wilson was adamant. "That's exactly the section we focused most carefully, because it's where most climbing accidents on the spire occur. That ledge with two bodies on it simply wasn't there in July 2004. Yet the forensic evidence and journal entries clearly indicated the twins had been on that ledge since the day of the storm. The contradiction could not be easily resolved. As the investigation continued, Alexander found himself drawn to the journal entries about the markings above the ledge. With the recovery operation complete, he requested permission to visit the site himself. Not to climb to the ledge, which would require technical expertise he no longer possessed, but to view it from the closest accessible vantage point. Standing at the base of Devil's Spire a week after the recovery, Alexander gazed up at the now emptied ledge where his sons had spent their final days. The morning light struck the rock face at an angle, illuminating what appeared to be faint lines etched into the stone above where the ledge protruded. With binoculars, he could just make out the markings Lucas had described. Geometric patterns that seemed to form a doorway shape around a section of the cliff face. As he watched, a cloud passed overhead, momentarily shadowing the area. When sunlight returned, Alexander lowered his binoculars slowly, a strange expression crossing his face. "They're gone," he whispered to Sergeant Powell, who had accompanied him. "The markings. They were there a moment ago, and now they're gone." Powell raised his own binoculars to look, seeing nothing but natural rock features. "Could have been a trick of the light," he suggested gently. Alexander nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe the door only appears when it needs to." 3 weeks after the recovery of Logan and Lucas Bennett's remains, Alexander sat in a coffee shop in Pinedale, reviewing a copy of the official investigation report provided by Sergeant Powell. The document was comprehensive, but ultimately unsatisfying, classifying the deaths as accidental with contributing factors of severe weather and inaccessible terrain preventing rescue or earlier discovery. The report made no mention of the strange markings described in the journal, the anomalous soil samples, or the contradictory testimony about the visibility of the ledge during the initial search. These elements had been filed separately as unverified observations, not pertinent to the cause of death determination. As Alexander closed the folder, a man at a neighboring table leaned toward him. "You're the Bennett twins' father, aren't you?" he asked quietly. Alexander nodded, warily, accustomed to being recognized in the small town where his search had become local legend. "I'm Robert Blackhawk. My uncle is Joseph Running Bear, the elder who consulted on your son's case. I was wondering if I might show you something." Intrigued, Alexander agreed. Blackhawk led him to the local library where he had reserved a research room.
Inside, he unrolled a large topographical map of the Wind River Range with certain areas marked in red. I've been researching disappearances in these mountains for my graduate thesis, focusing specifically on cases with unusual elements, where the evidence doesn't quite add up, or where the missing were eventually found in circumstances that defy conventional explanation.
He pointed to a red circle encompassing Devil's Spire. Your son's case caught my attention immediately because it fits a pattern I've been tracking. There have been 7 other incidents since 1879 where climbers or hikers disappeared in this specific area, only to be found later in locations that had been thoroughly searched previously. Alexander studied the map with growing interest. You're saying others have appeared in places they couldn't possibly have been? Black Hawk nodded. The most recent was in 1995. A solo hiker named Daniel Kershaw went missing during a day hike near Seneca Lake. Search teams covered the entire area extensively for 2 weeks with no result. 3 months later, a fishing party found him sitting beside the lake, alive but disoriented, with no memory of where he'd been. Medical examination showed no signs of exposure or starvation, despite his having disappeared in October and being found in January through Wyoming's harshest winter months. "What's the connection to my sons?" Alexander asked. "This," Black Hawk said, unfolding a faded photograph. "It was taken by Kershaw's friend the day before he disappeared." The image showed Kershaw standing beside Seneca Lake, smiling at the camera. In the background, barely noticeable until pointed out, was a rock formation with markings etched into its surface, markings virtually identical to those Lucas had described in his journal. "These symbols appear in all 7 cases," Black Hawk continued. "My people call them the waymarks. They're said to indicate places where the boundary between worlds grows thin under certain conditions." Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What conditions?" "That varies in the stories. Some say during storms, others at certain astronomical alignments. But there's one consistent element. They appear most often to those with the strongest bonds to another person. Twins, especially identical twins, are mentioned specifically in some of the oldest accounts." The conversation with Black Hawk sent Alexander in a new direction. Rather than focusing solely on the physical evidence of his son's deaths, he began researching other cases with similar elements, not just in the Wind River Range, but throughout regions with significant indigenous histories. His investigation led him to Ranger Thomas Black Hawk, who had coordinated with search teams during the initial hunt for the twins. Though retired now, Black Hawk had kept detailed personal notes beyond his official reports. "There was something about that search that never sat right with me," the former ranger admitted when Alexander visited him at his home outside Jackson. "We had perfect search conditions for several days after the storm cleared. Visibility for miles, clear skies. We flew directly over the western face multiple times. That ledge simply wasn't there, or at least not visible to us." "Could it have been hidden by shadows or an optical illusion of some kind?" Alexander pressed. Black Hawk considered this. "I've been a ranger in those mountains for 30 years. I know every trick of light, every shadow pattern through the seasons. This was different. It was as if that section of the mountain shifted somehow between the search and when your sons were found." He reached for a folder on his bookshelf, removing a photograph Alexander had never seen before.
This was taken during the aerial search on July 24, 2004. It shows the exact section of the western face where your sons were eventually found. Alexander studied the image intently. The area was clearly visible, the rock face smooth and uninterrupted where the ledge should have been. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "According to Lucas's journal, they were already on that ledge by this date." "Exactly," Blackhawk said. "Now look at this." He produced a second photograph, this one taken from almost the identical angle during the recovery operation in 2011. The difference was striking. The ledge was clearly visible, protruding from the rock face exactly where the twins had been found. The official explanation was that the ledge was simply missed during the initial search due to shadows or the angle of observation. But these photos were taken at the same time of day, from the same altitude and position. The ledge simply wasn't there in 2004. At least not in a way our cameras could capture. This revelation led Alexander to a theory that synthesized the various strands of evidence, the strange markings, the twins' final journal entries, the contradictory search photos, and the pattern of similar cases throughout the region's history. What if the ledge exists in two places at once? Not in a metaphysical sense necessarily, but what if there are conditions under which certain features of these mountains become displaced somehow, visible from some perspectives but not others? Sullivan, a pragmatic investigator throughout his career, would normally have dismissed such speculation outright, but the evidence in the Bennett case had challenged his worldview. "There are tribal stories about such places," he acknowledged reluctantly. "Areas where the normal rules don't quite apply. Most of us in law enforcement write them off as superstition, but I've worked cases in these mountains for 30 years, and I've seen things that don't fit neatly into reports."
The breakthrough came when Alexander connected with Dr. Eleanor Rigsby, a geophysicist studying unusual electromagnetic properties in certain rock formations throughout the Rocky Mountains. Rigsby had documented anomalies, specifically in the type of granite that formed Devil's Spire. "These formations sometimes exhibit properties that affect perception," she explained when Alexander visited her laboratory at Colorado State University. "Under specific conditions, usually involving electrical charges in the atmosphere during storms, they can bend light in ways that effectively render certain features invisible from most angles." Could that explain why a ledge might be invisible during a search, even though it physically existed? Alexander asked. Rigsby hesitated. "From a purely scientific perspective, it's possible, though highly improbable. But there's another factor at work in the Wind River Range that complicates matters. The granite there contains unusually high concentrations of magnetite and quartz, creating what we call a piezoelectric effect during lightning strikes. This can temporarily alter the electromagnetic field around the formation." "Alter it how?" Alexander pressed. "In layman's terms, it can create a localized distortion in how light behaves around the rock. In extreme cases, this might render certain features effectively invisible to observers and cameras while being physically present the entire time." It wasn't a complete explanation, but it provided a scientific framework that could potentially account for some of the anomalies in the case. Combined with the indigenous knowledge Blackhawk had shared, Alexander began piecing together a theory about what had happened to his sons, a theory that bridged the gap between empirical evidence and the more inexplicable elements of their final days. With this new perspective, he returned to the Wind River Range one more time, not to search or investigate, but to understand, to see the mountain as his sons might have seen it in their final moments, caught between worlds on a ledge that existed and didn't exist, depending on who was looking and how and when. Standing at the base of Devil's Spire, Alexander finally felt a sense of connection to Logan and Lucas that had eluded him throughout his search. They hadn't simply disappeared, nor had they merely died in a climbing accident. They had experienced something on that mountain that transcended ordinary understanding, something that the journal entries, with all their strange observations and shifting perceptions, had tried to articulate. "They found a doorway," he whispered to the silent stone face rising above him. "Whether it was physical or spiritual or something science doesn't yet have words for, they found it together." On a cool September morning in 2011, 2 months after the recovery of the Bennett twins' remains, Alexander stood in a conference room at the Wyoming State Police headquarters in Cheyenne. Around the table sat everyone who had played a significant role in either the search or the investigation: Detective Sullivan, Sergeant Powell, Dr. Vashenko, climbing expert Mendoza, tribal elder running there, and Robert Blackhawk. The purpose of the meeting was to officially close the case with a comprehensive review of all evidence and findings. "Based on the forensic analysis, witness testimony, and journal entries," Sergeant Powell began, "we've reconstructed the most likely sequence of events leading to Logan and Lucas Bennett's deaths. The official reconstruction, supported by physical evidence, painted a clear picture of what had happened on July 20th, 2004. The twins had begun their ascent of the western face early that morning, making good progress until mid-afternoon when they reached approximately 800 feet. Logan, leading that pitch, was fully exposed on the rock face when the storm hit with unexpected ferocity. A lightning strike near his position caused him to lose his grip. He fell approximately 20 feet before his last protection caught him, but the impact against the rock face caused catastrophic injuries to both legs. Lucas, anchored at a belay station on the small ledge, managed, through extraordinary effort, to raise his injured brother to the relative safety of the ledge. With their radio damaged in the storm, no way to descend safely with Logan's injuries, and the ledge too small and exposed for helicopter rescue, even if they had been able to signal for help, the twins were effectively trapped. Lucas attempted to care for his brother with their limited first-aid supplies, but Logan's condition deteriorated from infection and exposure. According to the journal entries, Logan Bennett died on the night of July 29th, 9 days after the accident. Lucas Bennett, weakened by dehydration and exposure, used his remaining strength to secure both himself and his brother's body to the ledge using their climbing equipment. Based on his final journal entry and the condition of his remains, we believe he died approximately 1 day later, on July 30th. This reconstruction explained the physical evidence, the nature of Logan's injuries, the condition of the equipment, the positioning of the bodies. What it couldn't fully account for were the anomalies surrounding the search and recovery. The question that has persisted throughout this investigation, Powell acknowledged, is why the twins weren't spotted during the extensive search operation, despite being located on a ledge that should have been visible from both air and ground observation points.
Dr. Rigsby, invited to contribute her scientific perspective, offered the most plausible conventional explanation: the combination of the ledge's position, shadows created by the rock face at different times of day, and the twins' likely efforts to shelter from the elements could have made them extremely difficult to spot, even during methodical search operations. This explanation satisfied the requirements of the official report, but Alexander knew there was more to the story, aspects that wouldn't appear in any police document, but were no less real for their absence. After the meeting concluded and the official case file was closed, a smaller group remained: Alexander, Running Bear, Robert Blackhawk, and somewhat surprisingly, Detective Sullivan. They moved to a more private setting, where they could speak freely about the elements of the case that defied conventional explanation.
My people have stories about the mountains that go back countless generations, Running Bear began. They tell of places where the membrane between worlds goes thin, where those with special connections, like twins, can sometimes pass between realms, especially in moments of great need or during powerful natural events like storms. The markings Lucas described in the journal appear in many of these stories, Robert Blackhawk added. They're said to be visible only to those who are attuned to this transition. The fact that both brothers saw them, first Logan and then Lucas, suggests they were experiencing this phenomenon. Sullivan, who had maintained professional skepticism throughout the investigation, spoke carefully. I've worked law enforcement in these mountains for 3 decades. There are cases in our files, not many, but enough to notice, where the evidence simply doesn't add up according to normal physical laws. Disappearances where the person is found in an area that was thoroughly searched, objects that appear to have moved impossible distances, survivals that defy medical explanation. He paused, choosing his words deliberately. I'm not saying that I believe in doorways between worlds or anything mystical, but I am saying that in certain places, under certain conditions, the normal rules we rely on seem to flex. Alexander removed Lucas's journal from his bag, opening it to the final entries. My sons weren't just victims of a climbing accident, he said firmly. They experienced something on that mountain that transcends our usual understanding of reality. The journal makes that clear if you're willing to see it. He read aloud from the entry dated July 29th. The brothers came today. Not in body, but I felt them here. The ones this spire was named for, I think. They showed me how to secure us to the rock so we'll stay together. Lucas was describing the Shoshone brothers who died on that same mountain in the 1870s, Running Bear explained. Our stories say they now guard the threshold, guiding those who find themselves caught between worlds. The rope configuration, the unusual arrangement that had preserved the twins' bodies in their precise position for 7 years, suddenly made sense in this context. It wasn't just a desperate attempt by a dying man to secure himself and his brother's body to the ledge. It was something more intentional, more profound, a configuration designed not just to withstand the elements, but to bridge the gap between worlds. Look at these anchor placements, Alexander said, spreading photographs from the recovery operation across the table. They formed the same pattern as the symbols Lucas described seeing on the rock face above them. It's as if he was recreating those markings with the ropes and anchors. Sullivan studied the images with new eyes. The technical expertise required to create this system goes beyond what even an experienced climber like Lucas should have been capable of, especially in his weakened condition. It's almost as if he had help, Alexander finished, from someone or something that understood both the physical requirements of securing them to the mountain and the other aspects at work. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, Nancy Rodriguez, the helicopter pilot who had first spotted the remains. She had contacted Alexander privately after the recovery, troubled by something she hadn't included in her official report. When we first circled the ledge, I saw something I can't explain. For just a moment, it looked like there were 4 figures on that ledge, not 2. 2 skeletal remains in climbing harnesses, yes, but also 2 standing figures, like shadows, but more substantial, positioned beside them. By the second pass, they were gone. Alexander shared this account with the small group now gathered around the table. He said, I believe my sons found themselves in what Running Bear's people call a threshold place, trapped between life and death, between worlds. The storm, the twins' bond,
the sacred nature of the mountain, all of these created conditions where something beyond our normal understanding occurred. "What exactly are you suggesting happened?" Sullivan asked. "I believe Logan died as the forensic evidence indicates, from his injuries and resulting infection. But Lucas, in his final moments, experienced something transcendent. The markings, the voices he described, the brothers who showed him how. These weren't hallucinations of a dying man. They were glimpses of the threshold he was crossing." Running there nodded slowly. "In our traditions, twins are considered specially connected to these threshold places. They begin life as one spirit that divides into two bodies. In death, especially death that comes in sacred places, they may experience the reunification of that spirit in ways others cannot." The rope configuration, seen in this light, wasn't merely a technical solution to a physical problem. It was Lucas's final act of brotherhood, creating a connection that would transcend physical death, guided by those who had crossed the threshold before him.
The reason the search teams didn't find them, Alexander concluded, wasn't just because of shadows or search patterns or bad luck. It was because, in some profound way, Logan and Lucas weren't fully in our world anymore. The ledge existed physically, yes, but it also existed somewhere else, somewhere beyond ordinary perception. Only when conditions aligned again 7 years later did they become visible to us. Sullivan, the career detective who had built his life on tangible evidence and logical deductions, might have dismissed such talk as the desperate rationalization of a grieving father. But he had seen the photographs, read the journal, and examined the evidence with his own eyes. "I can't put any of this in my official report," he said finally, "but off the record, I think you might be right, Mr. Bennett. I think your sons found something on that mountain that most of us will never understand. A door that opens only under the rarest circumstances for those with the deepest connections." As the small group dispersed, Alexander felt a sense of peace that had eluded him throughout his 7-year search. The truth about his son's final days wasn't just the clinical sequence of an accident, survival attempt, and eventual death from exposure. It was also the story of a bond between brothers that transcended physical limits, a bond that, in the end, may have allowed them to cross a threshold together, rather than remain separated by the boundary between life and death. The Bennett twins hadn't just died on Devil's Spire. In some profound way that defied conventional understanding, but resonated with the deepest human intuitions about love and connection, they had found a path to remain together, guided by those who had walked that path before them. The official funeral for Logan and Lucas Bennett took place on a bright October day in Bozeman, Montana. The small church overflowed with family, friends, and members of the climbing community who had supported Alexander through his 7-year search. The twins' climbing equipment, their harnesses, carabiners, and the rope that had connected them in life and death was displayed alongside their photographs. Alexander had chosen to have his sons cremated, their ashes combined in a single urn carved from granite sourced from the Wind River Range. During the service, he spoke not of loss, but of transcendence. "My sons lived for the mountains," he told the gathered mourners. "They found their truest selves on the rock face, testing their limits, relying on each other completely. In the end, they died as they lived, together,
facing challenges most of us will never comprehend, refusing to abandon each other even when survival might have demanded it. He didn't share the full truth as he had come to understand it, the threshold, the markings, the helpers from beyond. Those aspects of the story remained private, shared only with those who had experienced similar phenomena or whose cultural traditions embraced such possibilities. In the months following the funeral, Alexander channeled his grief into action. He established the Bennett Brothers Foundation for Mountain Safety, an organization dedicated to improving search and rescue protocols and equipment in remote alpine environments. The Foundation's first initiative funded research into new imaging technologies that could detect human presence on rock faces even in challenging light conditions or adverse weather. If these technologies had existed in 2004, Alexander explained at the launch event, my sons might have been found during the initial search. Their story has ended, but we can ensure other climbers have a better chance at rescue when the unexpected happens. The climbing community embraced the Foundation's work enthusiastically. Equipment manufacturers partnered with Alexander to develop new emergency signaling devices that could function even after exposure to severe weather. Search and rescue teams across the Rocky Mountain region received grants for training in the latest location techniques. Donna Harris, the family friend who had witnessed the twins' first climb, became the Foundation's Director of Education. We're not just teaching physical safety, we're also addressing the psychological aspects of survival in extreme situations. The Bennett twins' experience shows how the bond between climbing partners can be both a source of strength and, in some cases, the determining factor in life or death decisions. The Foundation also worked with indigenous communities throughout the region to document traditional knowledge about mountain environments. This unusual partnership, spearheaded by Robert Blackhawk, created a unique database combining scientific data with generations of observational wisdom about weather patterns, terrain risks, and survival strategies. Western science and indigenous knowledge aren't opposing systems. They're complementary ways of understanding the same reality. The Bennett case demonstrates how both perspectives are necessary to comprehend what happens in these sacred places. For Alexander personally, the year following his son's recovery and burial brought profound changes. He retired from teaching, sold his Montana home, and built a small cabin on the outskirts of Pinedale, Wyoming, close enough to the Wind River Range to see Devil's Spire on clear days, but far enough to begin a new chapter.
In spring 2012, he began climbing again. Not the technical ascents he had once mastered, but simple routes on the lower peaks surrounding his new home. On these solitary climbs, he often felt a sense of connection to Logan and Lucas that transcended ordinary memory or imagination. Sometimes, when the light hits the rock just right, or when the wind sounds a certain way, I feel them with me, he confided to Sullivan during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. Not as ghosts or spirits in any conventional sense, but as a presence that exists somewhere beyond ordinary perception. Sullivan, who had taken early retirement after closing the Bennett case, had also moved to Wyoming, serving as a consultant for the Foundation. The career detective and the grieving father had formed an unlikely friendship, bound by their shared experience of something that defied conventional explanation. I spent 30 years believing only in what I could see, touch, and measure, Sullivan admitted. The Bennett case taught me that reality is more complex, more mysterious than our typical frameworks allow.
I'm not saying I believe in the supernatural now, but I've learned to hold space for experiences that don't fit neatly into our usual categories of understanding. On the first anniversary of the recovery, Alexander participated in a ceremony at the base of Devil's Spire, joined by Running Bear, Black Hawk, and several other Shoshone elders who had helped him understand the deeper dimensions of his son's experience. The ceremony wasn't just a memorial, but an acknowledgement of the threshold between worlds that the twins had encountered. In our tradition, Running Bear explained to the small gathering, we don't think of death as an ending, but as a transition. The Bennett brothers found a doorway few others ever perceive. Their story reminds us that the boundaries we think are fixed and impermeable may actually be more fluid than we realize. As part of the ceremony, Alexander placed a small plaque at the base of the spire. Not a conventional memorial, but a marker bearing the symbol Lucas had described seeing on the rock face above their ledge. The tribal elders had helped him recreate it based on the journal description and similar markings found throughout the region. This isn't just about remembering Logan and Lucas, Alexander said as he secured the plaque to a boulder. It's about acknowledging that there are aspects of existence that transcend our ordinary understanding, connections between people, between worlds that remain powerful even when conventional boundaries like life and death appear to separate us. As the small group departed, Alexander lingered for a moment, looking up at the now familiar western face where his sons had spent their final days. For an instant, as the setting sun struck the rock face at a particular angle, he thought he saw a flash of the ledge, and perhaps, though he could never be certain, two figures seated side by side, looking out over the valley below. Whether this was a trick of light and shadow, a projection of his own longing, or a glimpse of something beyond ordinary perception, Alexander couldn't say with certainty. But he had learned to live with such ambiguities, to embrace the mystery rather than demand answers that might never come. "The mountain keeps its secrets," he whispered, echoing words Lucas had written in his journal. "But sometimes, if we're open to it, it also reveals truths we never expected to find." 1 year after the ceremony at Devil's Spire, the annual Bennett Brothers Memorial Climb brought together dozens of climbers from across the country. Unlike typical memorial events that focused on reaching summits, this gathering emphasized partnership, communication, and the bonds that form between climbers who trust each other with their lives. Alexander, now 64, but still fit from his regular climbs, addressed the group from a boulder at the base of the climbing area they had chosen, not Devil's Spire itself, which remained too technically challenging and emotionally charged, but a neighboring formation with moderate routes accessible to climbers of various skill levels. "My sons taught me many things," he told the gathered climbers, their faces upturned and attentive in the clear mountain light. "They taught me about persistence, about passion, about pursuing challenges that stretch you beyond what you thought was possible. But their final lesson, the one that took 7 years to fully understand, was about connection." He gestured to the climbing pairs preparing their equipment nearby. "You all know the peculiar intimacy of the climbing partnership, that wordless communication that develops when your life literally depends on another person, and theirs on you. Logan and Lucas had that connection from birth, deepened through years on the rock face. In the end, that bond transcended everything else, even the instinct for personal survival." As the climbers dispersed to begin their ascents, Alexander remained at the base with those who had been closest to the case: Sullivan, Running Bear, Black Hawk, and Dr. Rigsby, whose research into the unusual properties of the Wind River granite had continued with funding from the Bennett Foundation. The scientific paper on the electromagnetic anomalies around Devil's Spire has been accepted for publication, Rigsby informed the small group. It doesn't address the more unusual aspects of the case, of course, but it does establish that there are measurable physical phenomena in that location that could affect perception under certain conditions. Sullivan nodded appreciatively. Science gives us one framework for understanding what happened to the Bennett twins. Tradition offers another. I've come to believe that both are necessary, but neither is sufficient alone. Running Bear, his face weathered by decades in these mountains, added his perspective. The threshold places have always existed. What changes is our willingness to perceive them, to accept experiences that challenge our assumptions about the boundaries of reality. Alexander listened to these perspectives with the equanimity of someone who had moved beyond the desperate need for absolute certainty. The truth about his son's final days existed at the intersection of multiple ways of knowing: forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, scientific analysis, cultural wisdom, and his own intuitive understanding as their father.
As the afternoon progressed, climbers returned from their routes, sharing stories and forming the kinds of connections that had defined the Bennett twins' relationship. Alexander watched them with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his son's legacy lived on not just in the Foundation's work or the safety protocols they had inspired, but in every moment climbers protected each other on the rock face. At sunset, the group gathered one final time for a simple ceremony. Each climber placed a small stone on a cairn that had been started the previous year, growing it higher with each new contribution. No speeches were made. None were necessary. The growing tower of stones spoke for itself, a testament to accumulated experiences, shared challenges, and the bonds that form when humans face the mountain together. As darkness fell and the group began their descent to the valley, Alexander lingered behind, looking up at the stars emerging in the clear mountain sky. He thought of the journal entry where Lucas had described the stars seeming closer, more immediate on that exposed ledge. Not just distant points of light, but presences that somehow acknowledged the brothers in their extremity. The mystery of what Logan and Lucas had experienced in their final days would never be fully resolved. Perhaps it was a hallucinatory comfort for a dying man. Perhaps a glimpse of something beyond ordinary perception. Perhaps some combination of both. What mattered, Alexander had come to believe, wasn't the precise categorization of their experience, but its essential truth. That the connection between his sons had transcended what most people would consider the ultimate boundary. As he finally turned to follow the others down the trail, Alexander felt a peculiar shift in the air around him. Not a physical wind, but something subtler, a momentary thinning of whatever separates the known from the unknown. For just an instant, he had the distinct impression of Lucas's voice, as clear as if his son stood beside him. The ropes held, Dad, they're still holding. Whether this was memory, imagination, or something else entirely, Alexander embraced it without questioning. 7 years of searching had taught him that some truths can only be approached through openness to possibility rather than insistence on certainty. The twins' story had become more than a tragedy or even a mystery. It had evolved into something like a parable about the nature of connection, how bonds formed in life might continue in ways that transcend our usual understanding of time, space, and mortality. As he finally turned to follow the others down the trail, Alexander felt a peculiar shift in the air around him, not a physical air, but a momentary thinning of whatever separates the known from the unknown. For just an instant, he had the distinct impression of Lucas's voice, as clear as if his son stood beside him. "The ropes held, Dad. They're still holding." Whether this was memory, imagination, or something else entirely, Alexander embraced it without questioning. 7 years of searching had taught him that some truths can only be approached through openness to possibility, rather than insistence on certainty. The twins' story had become more than a tragedy, or even a mystery. It had evolved into something like a parable about the nature of connection, how bonds formed in life might continue in ways that transcend our usual understanding of time, space, and mortality. As he finally reached the trailhead where the other climbers waited, Alexander looked back one last time at the silhouette of the mountains against the night sky. The Bennett brothers had not been conquered by those peaks, he realized, nor had they conquered them. Instead, they had become part of them. Not just literally in the sense that their ashes now mingled with the stone and soil, but in some deeper way that the threshold markings had tried to articulate. "They found their way home," he whispered to the darkness. "Not the home they left, but the one they were always heading toward." And with that understanding, Alexander Bennett finally completed his own journey, not to rescue his sons, which had proven impossible, but to comprehend the truth of what had happened to them on that remote ledge where worlds intersected, where brothers refused separation, and where love had proven stronger than the boundary between life and death itself.